Casey Anthony stepped into the national spotlight after the suspicious disappearance of her daughter, Kaylee Anthony. As her story unfolded, many believed that she was unquestionably guilty. The jury, however, felt differently due to the evidence considered by them to be circumstantial. Anthony was acquitted of the murder charge, but she found herself loathed by most of the general public. In October of 2008, a grand jury charges Casey on capital murder and other charges. Anthony pleads not guilty. In December of 2008, skeletal remains are found in a wooded area near the Anthony home by a utility worker. Authorities later announced the remains have been identified as Kaylee Anthony. In May of 2011, jury selection begins, and in July, the 7-woman, 5-man jury deliberates for 10 hours and 40 minutes before coming back with a verdict of not guilty of first-degree murder. Casey was also convicted of aggravated child abuse and aggravated manslaughter of a child. All reached a verdict of not guilty. Casey is found guilty of 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. Casey is also sentenced to 4 years in jail for 4 counts of lying to the police. The years will be served consecutively and will include the time she has already served. She is also fined $1,000 for each count of false information. On July 17, 2011, Anthony is released from jail. A report is released by Florida's Department of Child and Families concluding that Anthony is responsible for the death of her daughter. According to the report, police stated the actions or lack of actions by the alleged perpetrator ultimately resulted or contributed in the death of her child. So after all of this evidence is presented, how can someone so publicly seen as guilty become acquitted? We as a group choose to analyze the functionalist perspective and how it relates to the conflict that the jury for the trial faces. The functional approach to small group communication is concerned with the results or outcomes of group behaviors and structures. This perspective sees communication as the tool group members use to solve problems and make decisions. Communication helps group members by promoting rational judgments and critical thinking, as well as preventing group members from faulty decision-making and flawed problem-solving. Thus, communication is instrumental because it provides the means by which group members can achieve their goals. From a functional perspective, researchers are concerned with identifying the specific aspects of group communication and structure that produce the group's desired outcome. Research conducted from this perspective suggests that several conditions must exist in order for group members to make appropriate decisions and effectively solve their problems.
So the functionalist theory claims that there's 4 steps to ensure good, productive group decision-making. Step 1 would be problem analysis. This is where small groups come together and get the first good look of the problem that they're dealing with. Here, groups must address what the true problems are and what possible contributing factors could be causing those problems. So our group is looking at juries, specifically in the Casey Anthony case. Juries are introduced to problem analysis inside the courtroom. So this is where the defendants and the victim party are pleading their cases. Attorneys are talking about, in our case specifically, whether Casey Anthony was guilty or not, that sort of thing. So this is where they're kind of getting a background information on what exactly the issue is at hand, and then from there you go to step number 2, which is goal setting. The second step, small groups must identify operant criteria for making decisions. So essentially this is where small groups decides a solution or an outcome to the problem, the best one that they feel fit. So once you are able to agree upon a solution, you can kind of think about ways to get to your desired goal. So for the juries, it would be essentially whether or not they thought Casey Anthony was guilty of the crime. And this is sometimes hard when you think about it, because the jury is made up of so many people who come from so many different backgrounds, different diversity. You never know how their perspectives could differ from yours. So you might think it's easy to determine whether someone's guilty or not, but truthfully, when you really dig into these cases, it's not always so easy to come up with one mutual decision. So obviously the goal of any jury is to convict the guilty party, but it was especially important here because in Casey Anthony's case, because they were dealing with so many permanent issues: capital murder, neglect of child, and giving false information to the police. Step 3, it is to identify alternatives. So while you might have agreed to a possible solution, in step 2, it's also important to consider other solutions that you might not think are actually the answer to the problem, but still pertinent. So the evidence seemed pretty obvious that Casey Anthony was guilty. However, in her first trial, she wasn't convicted of murder. She was only convicted of child neglect. So this is really where the alternatives kind of came into play. And it was important to consider Casey Anthony had originally said that the babysitter ran off with the child, so while some of them might think that Casey Anthony is the one who murdered it, you also have these other lingering ideas that maybe someone did kidnap her, or maybe there are other instances that we don't necessarily know about yet. And then the final step is the evaluation and final decision. So originally the final decision in 2001 was Casey Anthony was not guilty, but it came out later that she actually was guilty of the crime many years later when further evidence was found. This last step is especially important because groups must evaluate all the possible outcomes that they came out with. Especially for juries, it's important because you don't want to false convict everyone, so it really is essential that you really dig deep and investigate all these possible solutions. That way you're properly trying someone for the crime that they committed.
I'm going to give you some information on how the jury probably could have had alternative decisions to choose from and other outcomes in order to convict Casey Anthony. So something that was really interesting in this case was 12 of the jurors, and there was 12 jurors in Casey Anthony's case. 7 of them were women. The other 5 were men. And also I want to bring up the fact that some of the charges that she was not found guilty for, and she was only found guilty for one of the charges. So some of the charges she was not found guilty for was first degree murder. She was also not found guilty of aggravated child abuse, and she was also not found guilty for manslaughter to a child. But she was found guilty of lying to law enforcement. Some of the alternative decisions that could have happened to find Casey guilty of her daughter's death may have been if all the jurors were women, because all women are passionate about their children, and this could have had cause to make Casey guilty. Some other outcomes, maybe if everyone in the juror had kids, and maybe this could have affected their decision on the outcome. The jury was also not 50 men and 50 women. Like I said, it was half. 7 of them were women and 5 of them were men. So maybe if half were men and half women, the outcome could have been different. There are just so many different outcomes that could have happened. This is an alternative decision that could have happened, and this is part of functional theory. One reason the jury did not convict Casey because they couldn't figure out how her daughter Kaylee was killed. So when they found her daughter Kaylee, there was duct tape to the skull, and the jury was confused. This just confused the jury actually more. And I feel like if they could have found out how her daughter was killed, then they would have been also able to convict Casey. An alternative decision I found was you don't have to prove a cause of death to convict someone. I also thought it was interesting. She had already got convicted of first degree, and the police hadn't even found her daughter's body yet. So why couldn't they have come to a decision without finding the body of Casey's daughter? We may never know what happened to Casey's daughter, Carly, but God rest her soul.
Part 4 of the functional theory are considered some of the most important parts. They're about evaluating the positive and negative aspects of all the alternative choices. And only by doing this can you come to a true high-quality decision. When a jury comes together, their main goal that brings them together is to make a decision of guilt based solely on the facts presented. In this theory, in order to come to a supreme decision, you need quality information to analyze, to both develop and weigh alternative decisions. In the case of Casey Anthony, The jury evaluated the pros and cons of the alternative decisions, but even though they felt that they should go with a guilty verdict based solely on their emotions, the cons heavily outweighed the pros in doing so based on the staggeringly sparse evidence presented by the prosecution given to support a guilty verdict. Many alternative possibilities open under a not guilty verdict. So there was just so many things left unsaid and undeveloped that there were so many other possibilities and positives to giving a non-guilty verdict that they couldn't, in good conscience, give the guilty verdict. The information that was presented to them, given the information that was presented to them, this jury went through all the steps of the functional theory and came back from deliberation with the only verdict that analytically made sense to them, which was not guilty. However, after the case was done, plenty of the jurors came out and said, I know Jennifer Ford said, the prosecution left too many questions unanswered, such as why she killed her daughter, who she did it with, if she was by herself, where it happened, when it happened, and how she did it. And in order to convict somebody of murder, those are things that they had to know. And the prosecution didn't do a good job in presenting evidence or any information or theories that supported any of that information. The only thing they did convict her on was lying to investigators. And then another juror also said that he wanted to convict based on just his emotions, but he knew that there wasn't enough evidence to do that. So I would say in conclusion, the jury did everything that they could have possibly done, and they did go through all the steps of the functional theory, but they weren't giving the quality of information that they needed to come out with a guilty verdict. So analytically, they did choose the supreme verdict, which was not guilty.